Hello everyone. In this session, I am going to discuss about literary terms starting with letter A. Our first literary term is absurd literature. It is the term is applied to a number of works in drama and prose fiction which have in common the sense that the human condition is essentially absurd and that this condition can be adequately represented only in works of literature that are themselves absurd. The famous writer of absurd literature is Samuel Beckett, the most eminent and influential writer in this mode, both in drama and in prose fiction. His plays, such as Waiting for Godot, 1954, project the irrationalism, helplessness, and absurdity of life in dramatic forms that reject realistic settings, logical reasoning, or a coherently evolving plot. Waiting for Godot presents two tramps in a waste place, fruitlessly and all but hopelessly, waiting for an unidentified person, Godot, who may or may not exist, and with whom they sometimes think they remember that they may have an appointment. As one of them remarks, nothing happened, nobody come, nobody goes, it's awful. And it is the best example of absurd literature. And the next literary term is act and scene. An act is a major division in the action of play. In England, this division was introduced by Elizabethan dramatists who imitated ancient Roman plays by structuring the action into 5 acts. Late in the 19th century, a number of writers followed the example of Chekhov and Ibsen by constructing plays in 4 acts. And in the present century, the most common form for non musical dramas has been 3 acts. Acts are often subdivided into scenes. Remember it. Acts are often subdivided into scenes, which in modern plays usually consists of units of action in which there is no change of place or break in the continuity of time. The next literary term is aesthetic movement. It was a European phenomenon during the later 19th century that had its chief headquarters in France, and the historical roots of asceticism are in the views proposed by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant in his Critique of Judgment, which was published in 1790, that the pure aesthetic expression consists of disinterest, contemplation of object, thus pleases for its own sake, without reference to reality or to the external ends of utility or morality. The view of French asceticism were introduced into Victorian England by Walter Pater with his emphasis on high artifice and stylistic subtlety. His recommendation to crowds one's life with execute sensation, and his advocacy of the supreme value of beauty and of the love of art for its own sake. And our next literary term is affective fallacy. In an essay published in 1946, W.K. Wimsett and Monroe Berkeley defined the affective fallacy as the error of evaluating a poem by its effect, especially its emotional effect upon the reader. As a result of this fallacy, the poem itself as an object of specifically critical judgment tends to disappear so that criticism ends in impressionism and relativism. And our next literary term is alienation affect. In his epic theater of the 1920s and later, the German dramatist Bertolt Brecht adapted the Russian formalistic concept of defamiliarization into what he called the alienation effect. The German term is also translated as estrangement effect or distancing effect. The last is closest to Brecht's notion in that it avoids the connotation of judginess, incapacity of feel, and social apathy that the word alienation has acquired in English. Next literary term is allegory. Allegory is a narrative, whether in prose or verse, in which the agents and action and sometimes the setting as well are contrived by the author to make coherent sense and sometimes on literal or primary level of signification and at the same time to signifying a second correlated order of signification. It has two main types, historical and political allegory. Our next literary term is a parable. It is a very short narrative about human beings presented so as to stress the tacit analogy or parallel with a general thesis or lesson that the narrator is trying to bring home to his audience. Our next literary term is alliteration. It is the repetition of a speech sound in a sequence of nearby words. The term is usually applied only to consonant and only when the recurrent sound begins a word or a stressed syllable within a word. In Old English alternative meter, alliteration is the principal organizing device of the verse line. The verse is unrhymed. Each line is divided into two half lines of two strong stresses by a decisive pause and at least one and usually both of the two stress label in the first half line alliterate with the first stress label of the second half line. A number of Middle English poems such as William Langland's The Romance Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, both written in 14th century and continue to use and play variation upon the old alliterative meter. Our next literary term is allusion. It is a passing reference without explicit identification to a literary or historical person, place, or event, or to another literary work or passage. In the Elizabethan Thomas Nash Litany in Time of Play, the unidentified Helen in the last line alludes to Helen of Troy. Most allusions serve to illustrate or expand upon or enhance a subject, but some are used in order to undercut it ironically by the discrepancy between the subject and the allusion. And our next literary term is ambiguity. In ordinary usage, ambiguity is applied to a fault in style, that is, the use of a vague or equivocal expression when what is wanted is precision and particularly of reference. It has multiple meaning and plurignation are alternative terms for this use of language. They have the advantage of avoiding the pejorative associated with the word ambiguity. And our next literary term is antihero, the chief person in a modern novel or play whose character is wildly discrepant from that which we associate with the traditional protagonist or hero of a serious literary work. Instead, instead of manifesting largeness, dignity, power, or heroism, the anti-hero is petty, ignominious, passive, ineffectual, or dishonest. Our next literary term is antithesis, is a contrast or opposition in the meaning of contiguous phrases or clauses that manifest parallelism, that is a similar word order and structure in their syntax. Uh, for example, Alexander Pope's description of Atticus in his epistle to Dr. Arpinot, willing to wound. These are the example of antithesis. Our next literary term is archaism, the literary use of words and expression that have become obsolete in the common speech of the era. For example, Spenser's The Faerie Queene deliberately employed archaism, many of them derived from Chaucer's medieval English. Our next literary term is archetypal criticism. In literary criticism, the term archetype denotes recurrent narrative design, pattern of action, character types, themes, and images which are identifiable in a wide variety of works of literature as well as in myths, dramas, and even social rituals. Such recurrent items are held to be the result of elemental and universal forms or patterns in the human psyche, whose affective embodiment in a literary work evokes a profound response from the attentive reader because he or she shares the archetypes expressed by the author. And our next literary term is atmosphere. Atmosphere is the emotional tone pervading a section or the whole of a literary work which foster in the reader expectation as to the course of events, whether happy or terrifying. Shakespeare established the tense and fearful atmosphere at the beginning of Hamlet by the terse and nervous dialogue of the sentinels as they anticipate a reappearance of the ghost. Our next literary term is author and authorship. The prevailing conception of a literary author might be summarized as follows. Authors are individuals who, by their intellectual and imaginative power, purposefully create from the material of their experience and reading a literary work which is distinctly their own. The work itself, as distinct from the individual written or printed text that initiated the work, remains solely a product and insofar as the literary work turns out to be a great and original, the author who has composed that work is deservedly accorded high cultural status and achieves enduring fame. And in an influential essay, there is a question arises by Michael Foucault that what is an author? It was written in 1969. Coming into being of the notion of author, that is, the emergence and evolution of the author function within the discourse of our culture, and specified inquiries such as how the author become individualized, what status he has been given, what term of valorization involves the author, and how the fundamental category of the man and his work criticism began. Foucault's essay and example gave impetus to a number of historical studies which reject the notion that the prevailing concept of authorship, the set of attributes possessed by an author, is either natural by the way things are. Instead, conceive authorship to be a cultural construct that emerged and changed in accordance